special event where we are celebrating a new book by Seung-hoon Jeong, who is Assistant Professor of Cinema Studies at NYUAD. Seung-hoon has published widely on the areas of film theory and theory in general. He received Korea's Cine 21 Film Criticism Award in 2003. He began life as a film critic. He won a Domitille Essay Prize for work on early cinema, and his dissertation, out of which his book emerged, won the Society of Cinema and Media Studies Dissertation Award in 2012. He's a co-translator of Jacques Derrida's Acts of Literature, and he's currently co-editing a companion to Korean cinema. And he's also now embarked on a new large-scale research project on globalization, focusing on issues of cosmopolitanism, terrorism, network ecology, and catastrophe. But we're here to talk about his 2013 book entitled Cinematic Interfaces, Film Theory After New Media. Here it is. And there's also on the table in there a flyer advertising the book. I'm not going to say much about it, since Seung-hoon is going to speak at length, and then after which we will have a Q&A and an opportunity for general discussion. And I think refreshments are going to be served as well, right? Is that going to happen downstairs? Downstairs. All right. Please welcome Seung-hoon Jeong.
Thank you for coming. I see a lot of my professors and also my students. I'm so glad to have everybody here. I'd like to introduce my book, Cinematic Interfaces, just the main concepts with the concrete film example, so that you can grasp what cinematic interfaces mean in my framework. But then it's not that simple, actually. I took a lot of slides, and I'm a little worried about, if I could catch up everything. So if I don't finish everything, I will move on to discussion, and then you can still talk about it. Anyway, I'll try to show what I prepared for today. Okay, cinematic interfaces. It's about it's an attempt to go back to film theory using this concept of cinematic interface. Then why do I need? There's a kind of background. The history of film theory shows that the so-called grand theory dominated the 1970s and 1960s and 70s scholarship based on semiotics, psychoanalysis, Marxism. Then in the 1990s and 80s, there were kind of several major turns from this grand theory, such as ontology by Routledge, phenomenology using Merleau-Ponty, cognitivism through Baudelaire and Carroll, and historicism by Gunning and other American film scholars and so on and so forth. But then these were important turns within the film studies, while in the 1990s we saw a very radical turn to media studies. And then because of the digital revolution. And it was like a break from film material, but at the same time it expanded the cinematic modes of the cinema, storytelling, narrative, and visualization, and so on and so forth. So it was like a kind of a challenge and change, but at the same time, a serious question about what cinema is. And the new media art and then media installation works or something like that digitally expanded the cinema. At the same time, a lot of scholars wanted to reconfigure and recontextualize cinema in a larger context of pre-digital and pre-cinematic optical devices, and also post-cinematic digital media and so on and so forth. So this was like a very revolutionary period in the discipline of film studies, and especially film theory. But then the issues were like a new media, new visual, and then new spectator, which means that this can be still addressed through rich film discourse on apparatus, image, and subjectivity. And that was my thought, which means that we should not simply put aside all the rich history of film theory, which dealt with all those important issues that could be revamped and updated with digital media and so on and so forth. So isn't there any new encompassing framework to actively respond to new challenges and while at the same time retroactively reconfigure all the film views. And then I found interface. When I woke up one day, suddenly it became to me. So that's good. That was my thesis. Then what is interface? In computer science, it was first introduced as a contact surface between humans and or machine components like computers, and usually HCI, which means human-computer interfaces. That one which we wrote seriously and substantially about. Now very common. We use them. For example, software interfaces like Windows and Mac, hardware interfaces like USB and LCD. User interface like a keyboard, mouse, touchpad, monitor, and so on and so forth. So we are actually surrounded by all these interfaces. And then also for media studies, wanting to kind of adopt this specific term in order to kind of revamp certain devices or apparatus like a cinema. The cinema itself now is redefined, it was redefined cultural interface technology. And the screen itself could be seen as a perceptual interface as opposed to or compared to other interfaces like a window in the primitive form, perspective in the kind of the symbolic visual form, and so on and so forth. And then also, a lot of scholars are quite into the body itself as a certain type of interface. So I would say it's already an embodied interface, without which we cannot have access to a certain information which is already digitally codified and so on and so forth. So this seems to me to be a very rich kind of ground to talk about and develop. And then how can the concept of this interface apply to cinema, and why is it worthwhile bringing to film theory and beyond? I think there are four merits. First of all, the term itself has very specific meaning, like the camera, the film strip, and the screen. And these are the main three cinematic interfaces that I define. So these could be called medium interfaces. But at the same time, interface, the term itself implies the surface and also face. And then the surface of the object, and then the face of the subject. When it comes to on screen, sometimes it creates a certain interface effect that I want to define and then develop. So it has a certain flexibility. And also, the itself is very universally applicable to certain concepts, which is very important in general. For example, now relationality seems to precede any identity. So before we construct our identity, we actually communicate or we actually connect to other people, without which we cannot actually have our own individuality and so on and so forth. So it's, in some sense, it's already very, very common and part of everyday life. Our Facebook page consists of links to other pages and the photos that other people put and so on and so forth, rather than we always create our own individuality. Okay? So this kind of relationality and connectivity itself is the primary ground of identity and subjectivity. This idea seems to be very pertinent in terms of interface. Finally, interface. Now you can find this term in many other disciplines than just cinema studies or video studies. If you, for example, just put this word on the Baxter website of NYU library, it appears in so many disciplines, from media studies and computer science to linguistics, social science, politics, engineering, and so on and so on and so forth. So it's already very intermediate and also interdisciplinary. And though each discipline has its own way of using this term and then its own subject matter, I think that there might be kind of a general theory of interface. And then a few scholars seems to work on this kind of issue. So how can we create a theory of interface based on many different disciplines and so on and so forth? It's like a meta-theoretical approach to interface. And I'd like to point out something related to this concept at my conclusion. So anyway, I examine how interface appears and work in cinema. First of all, for example, as I said, there's a medium interface, camera, film strip, screen, and then it directly appears in some films, right? And then also there is a subject who is the main film character in many cases. And then sometimes the subject does not just simply see this interface, but also wants to contact it physically, touching the screen and so on and so forth. So bodily contact, direct contact with the interface is another big important issue for me. But at the same time, on the side of the object, it can the surface of the object itself can sometimes appear like an interface, like a quasi-camera or screen and so on. And I will talk about it too. So it's like an indirect interface. On the opposite side, the face of the human subject itself. So it's not a camera, it's not a movie, film strip and so on. But at the same time, we can talk about it as a kind of interface using the notion of the interfaciality that I want to develop in this broader paper.
Sorry, so direct means it actually something which appears in the field. Direct, right?
Yes.
Direct means it actually appears in the field.
Yes.
It's visible, and what does indirect mean?
Indirect means that there is no camera, but then a certain object appears like a camera. Works like a camera within the dialectic space. I will give you some examples. Okay, so this is the structure, and actually this is like my table of content. So I have 5 chapters with introduction that is about the cinematic apparatus itself as redefined as a conveyor belt interface. So these are conveyor belt actually, from object to subject to the subject through these medium interfaces. And any image goes through this series of interfaces through perception and memory, remediation, and so on and so forth. And that is the structure. So, and I want to look at the relationship between object and camera, and so on and so forth. But basically, this is the structure. So, first, there's medium interface, and the second, body interface. The third, what I call quasi-interfaces, include the object of the surface of the object, and then the face of the subject. And finally, image and subject itself, themselves as interfacial. And then that will be my conclusion. And by looking at these things, I also want to kind of reconfigure film theory, especially focusing on major film theory concepts like a suture, embodiment, illusion, and signification, finally indexicality. So these are very, very important film concepts that many scholars want to talk about and so on. And then I use this, I kind of retroactively retrace the history of the ideas about this concept, while redefining them through the notion of interface. And this is also the way I kind of redefine interface itself. So interface is not simply applied to cinema, but I kind of try to recreate what can be an interface. What is kind of interfaciality? And I redefine, for example, is as a kind of asymmetrical mutuality, ambivalent tactility, human virtuality, and multiple directionality, and so on and so forth. Well, I will talk about that. But basically, the point is that the interface for me is not simply a kind of communicative tool that relates people, that connects people in a transparent mutuality. But rather, sometimes that is very, very common sense of the interface in leaders. Right? It's efficient, it's transparent, it allows us to connect other people without obstacles and so on. But when I see some important cases of the cinematic interfaces appearing on cinema, as I mentioned, it seems like an interface actually does not simply communicate with other things, but sometimes it works the very communication. It's not that transparent. And then it's not that really symmetrical. So many different aspects or characteristics of the interface could be found in cinema. Why it is important? Because then the nature of the interface is very, very ambivalent. On one hand, we need it in order to understand the world. On the other hand, it actually kind of stops us from going into the very real of the world and so on and so forth. That this ambivalence itself is the nature of the interface, without which we cannot really have access to the world itself. So in this sense, I wanted to kind of create a kind of more complex but synthetic notion of interfaciality. Now I'll briefly talk about each of these aspects with some examples. First of all, Actually, Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window is not my focus at all, but then I just brought it for this talk because everybody will know this film, so it will be easy for me to talk about these things. So it's like a portal film in my case. Actually, in each of my chapters in my book, there is always a portal film. So I start with a specific film analysis and goes into the theory of the history of ideas, and then see other films and so on. So today's case, I think Rear Window may be an important, very useful portal film. Because there's a camera, right? So Jeff uses the camera as like a medium interface. So Jeff is a photographer who is also an allegory for a film spectator. Right? Immobile in the dark, he is on a wheelchair after an accident. At the same time, his eye and his mind are very extremely mobilized by the camera too. So, and he enjoys the pleasure of peeping into other people's life, often romantic and sexual. Then he becomes a kind of private detective, investigating a crime on the other side of his apartment he spies on. And so, kind of the voyeuristic male gaze becomes a surveillance camera, a personified CCTV. So in this case, a cinematic interface sets up a narrative space and action while causing asymmetrical tension between seeable, the seeable and the unseeable, the knowable and the unknowable. So, to see means actually to know, and he wants to know through seeing and so on. So perception and knowledge are combined together in a way of achieving his goal to illuminate and even come invisible truth, on the other side of this apartment. And that is the story, as you may know. On the other hand, he observes people to somewhat avoid his own reality, where his girlfriend, Grace Kelly, wants marriage, which he actually hesitated to accept, maybe because it means giving up his freedom. In this sense, the neighbor's mother of his wife might be his own unconscious desire staged in displacement, which he consciously wants to punish. So he punishes himself through the other's case, and so on, fittingly. So the whole film is a bizarre negotiation between his id and superego, psychoanalytically, while the Rear Window, the title, is open to his own deep psyche interface, which is the rear in the Renaissance of the time, as opposed to reality of his normal ego. Again, interface sets up this asymmetrical mutuality between reality and the rear, not easily communicating with the reality itself. So that is my basic concept of interface. So we have interfaces, we see a lot of things, but then we also sense that there is a lot of things that we cannot see. But then the interface still allows us to sense that there is something that we cannot see. And that this ambivalent mutuality is very, very important. So now let's go to Tisch by Michael Haneke, which is my portfolio for this chapter actually. Apparently it's very similar setting, right? And then this view, the facade of the building, and then this view. I'm not sure if it is intended, but it's almost like that. This seems like this looks like an objective message shot of the narrative space where the main character lives. But then he appears here. This is the main character, George, right? And then the next shot shows that okay, this is still George looks at himself in a video shot. Which means that the previous shot, if this is a shot and then this is the reverse shot, actually the reverse shot doesn't show the gaze of the previous shot itself. So it seems like an interesting case if you look at, for example, the suture theory here. And then here, this video is sent to him with him knowing nothing about it. Who shots this, who sends this, he doesn't know that. So this is a reverse shot, but the previous shot is inside in it. And then this is related to the concept of suture. So in the classical film theory, the suture means that the off-screen space is always put into the succession of a series of shots in the form of editing. So it's basically the principle of editing. So If you have one shot, we always are curious about who's looking at this shot, who creates this shot, and then that enunciator of the shot itself is visualized in the next shot. So this is the process of suture. But in this case, this suture stabilizes the continuity of narrative space and time, and it's very important. But then, for example, this Aristotle works with Bashir with a scene in which a horse is bad eye, but then the eye of a horse reflects, somebody actually is a soldier, Israeli soldier, who killed this horse, who's looking at this horse itself. So it seems like this is the condensation of a shot and then the reverse shot, and then Zizek talks about this kind of a condensation itself as interface, which means that something that is outside, that is off-screen space, comes into the diegetic space, but not in a normal way. But it can create a kind of a spectral effect, as if this slightly shifts into another dimension of reality, and so on and so forth. And then a visual symptom. So there is a visual symptom of the external other that cannot be completely sutured into the smooth continuity of reality. And then, so actually this is in some sense a desuture, if you want. So there is an imagery which should be sutured into the narrative space smoothly, so that we don't have to worry about continuity or whatever. But then there is always a kind of symptom that actually destabilizes this suture system, making us kind of disturbed. And we still are curious about who's there, who's looking at, and so on. So back to Cachet, the question remains like that. So video, this video is like a medium interface. It leaves the question of who shot this unanswered, this shot unanswered, and it opens the unsuturable interstice within reality. It turns out to be related to George's adopted later in the film. It turns out to be related to George's adopted but abandoned Algerian brother, whose miserable life has been lingering outside George's bourgeois life without George's memory of it. So it's the neglected rear of a post-colonial trait. But again, who shots and sends this video is never revealed. The suture as desuture, or the failure of a suture, comes into being in my case. So the interface just lets us sense this hidden rear, which is cache, means it means hidden. Why not allowing us to approach it? So this asymmetrical mutuality made me think about the relationship between perception and memory, and then related theories. So this is the first case, video interface. Suture as suture, but interface as a suture, but actually it is desuture. So there's a kind of the inherent disequilibrium between two sides of the same interface. So this is asymmetrical mutuality. And then I look back on the theory of suture in psychoanalysis, like Zizek's case, and the photogrammatology in Stewart, and then ontology in Bergson and Routledge, and so on and so forth. So many different ideas are examined. At the same time, my basic concept of suture here is this. It opens something that cannot be sutured into the visual field. Now, let me briefly talk about this structure in Lacan's case. So Lacan shows this diagram. Here, it seems like our eye is geometrical point. So we see the image of an eye. This is very common and clear. But then actually, this visuality itself is grounded on a visual field which is actually created by a point of light. Which means that, so let's take this as God. God says, okay, there should be light, and then there's a light. It's like that. There's a light, and then it shows, the picture in which we see everything. But then actually, the point of light itself is a screen, which means that it is not presented, it's behind this screen. We don't actually get access to this kind of point of light. But anyway, this always precedes our gaze, our look. So this is called gaze, this is called look. So the subject of a representation wants to see, the image of the object, while at the same time, the gaze of real itself always pre-constitutes this visuality. So before we actually see something, we have been already seen by this point of light. That was the basic idea of the Lacanian concept of perception. So that's again, the point is the asymmetrical. Again, the rear window and even Cachet suggest that before I photograph something, I'm already photographed by something else that cannot be completely sutured into digital, the visual place. Okay? But then there's always an interface, and then there was the function of the interface. Now, let me move to the second phase of this interface. This is, as you know, Julia Bertop's man with the camera. Interface is here, of course, the camera itself. It's not just a kind of the useful tool to investigate the whole world and so on and so forth, as it has been examined in many scholars in the film theory. I would like to say that this is it's not an artificial external extension of human senses. This is the basic notion of the nuance of technology. We need technology in order to extend our human bodies, our senses, and so on. The lenses are my extension of eyes. But this is very human-centered notion of technology. Whereas I'd like to suggest that probably the interface, this kind of interface itself, is already immanent in the human body. And how can I approach this idea? Actually, Henri Bergson suggests that everything in the world, in the material world, exists as an image that emits its own image toward the others, other things in the world, but at the same time receiving all images from the outer spaces, from the others as well. Which means that even though we don't see any motion in the sense that certain object moves from this point to that point, everything exists here without any motion. At the same time, it can exist in the way it appears to us, because everything itself is in this interplay of emitting its own image and then receiving others' images and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of a very fundamental notion of a movement without motion, the movement of this light and its interplay itself between all those things already immanently working in that way in the material. And then that was his idea of a kind of pure perception that is already immanent in the matter as such. And what is the difference between the eye, our human eye, and this kind of the immanent perception? Our eyes are always selective and then attentive, right? When I look at you, I don't see my behind. So this is different between me and me as an organism and the organ and then the other things. And then, so he says that the human eye is a kind of center of indetermination, because I can move around in this way. But at the same time, all things are decentered, because there's no center there. But at the same time, each thing exists in a specific, finite, determined place. So there's a kind of a contrast. But then the point is that our eye itself, in some sense, is considered as derived from those immanent perception in the material world as such. Which means that this is related to this type of images. So it's like this guy, when you do camera, is derived from the material ground, which consists of all numerous eyes. So this is the way the whole world exists. There's multitude, there's no subjectivity, and so on and so forth. And then one single eye comes out of it as if it is kind of the sutured form of this immanent gaze. So in that case, if you look at this film, especially at the end of this film, it's all about this contrast between one single eye and the multitude of these immanent eyes, which don't have actually eyes as organs. So they are just the things themselves. One single eye, even a metaphor, and then a lot of eyes, and then here light comes out too. And the final shot shows that the level of the iris of the camera and then the human iris too. But at the same time, rather than thinking about it as kind of symbolism or something like that, I would say it is about I am an interface before I have an external interface, which means that before I have a camera as an artificial external interface, my eye itself is already kind of an immanent interface, which is related to even the gaze in the material world, essentially. Okay. So this is a kind of a shift from Lacan to Bergson. In the case of Lacan, there is always the gaze that cannot be sutured into our visual place, but then we have an interface through which we can sense the kind of gaze, even though we cannot see that. And then this is the kind of the tripolar structure. Whereas in Bergson, the eyeless eyes in the material world are derived into human eyes. I mean, I put kind of big pun, but anyway, this is the concept. So I'm moving from the interface as an artificial external device to the body itself is already in. So this is the structure in terms of the suture as interface or interface as suture. That I developed into the first chapter. I think I can talk about one more chapter and then really move to another. So the second thing is about body. Again, back to rear window. Interestingly, in the rear window, as you may remember, Jeff, who cannot move, around, sends his girlfriend to investigate the other side of his building, right? In some sense, so his girlfriend, even when she moves around there, she wears a long dress, it shows her waist. It's like he wants to jump into the screen space, but then he cannot do that, so he sends his girlfriend. So his girlfriend is like an avatar of his own agency. So again, it suggests that there is always an impulse for bodily contact with the cinematic interface. The desire to go into or even go beyond a certain interface. When you watch an interface, when you watch an image on screen and so forth. So now we are moving from medium interface and its appearance itself, direct appearance itself, to the subject, the character subject's bodily contact with it. Jumping into the screen. And then actually the avatar is the updated version of a rear window because Jake itself, just like the Jeff, is immobile, he's handicapped, but then his eye and mind are extremely mobilized through the very avatar, which is now, undressed. And then in some sense it goes into the virtual world, which is another rear window. And then you have Steven Spielberg's Minority Report as an updated rear window as well. The agent here doesn't send an avatar to the screen work, but he himself jumps into it. Okay? When there is a crime which is already pre-mediated, he can, he wants to prevent it. So there's a kind of updated version of surveillance interface here, which is already related to the concept of pre-mediation that Richard Grusin talks about. The pre-mediation, the concept itself is actually we want to visualize all possible scenarios of a future event. So when it really happens, we are less shocked in some sense by its traumatic effect. But in some sci-fi films, using especially time traveling motif, actually people really want to stop a certain event from happening. So this pre-count system is self-configures. This is how it works in ultimate way. So it's almost like the war on a crime situation, which is embodied by a super low hero here, who intrudes private space with impunity, without any permission. And he just jumps in. But at the same time, this media expert himself is also a little like lured and seduced by this kind of hologram effect of his wife. And by watching it, he wants to even touch her, as if this is real. So this is related to the concept of the early cinema's Rube character. Rube as a countryman who doesn't know how cinema works, and so who thinks that the cinematic world is real, so he wants to jump into the screen space and so on and so forth. And then it is especially examined by Thomas Texas and other scholars looking at the early cinema, including this kind of this film, but it does Sherlock Jr. So Sherlock Jr., another real window figure who is a private detective, wants to go into the screen space, jumping into the screen space like that. And you have other examples like David Cronenberg's video drama that really shows, the process of going into the screen space. And it's also very sexual. And it's really, especially sexual penetration is key motif of this film. And then even in this, in the kind of the media space itself, he wants to touch, the screen image in this way, in a very self-masochistic way, until there's kind of the human-machine fusion occurring in his body. So it always, it seems like it testifies to the desire to go beyond the image into the body itself. So we see the image of the body, but through this image, we really want to go into that kind of body. On the other hand, this desire also erupts from within the screen towards the subject, in this case too. And then you can see other examples throughout the film history. For example, Rene Clair's Entr'acte ends with this ending. Somebody comes out of the screen from behind it, and then the tearing effect is always very, very palpable here. And then, for example, in the Japanese horror film Ring, there's a famous shot of the ghost within the video screen comes out into the reality. So the effect of the image becoming object, which was in some sense very Bazinian in terms of illusion effect and so on and so forth, is visually actually realized in this way. I think it is all about the screen, the touching screen. Back in Videodrome, this desire to penetrate the screen, however, ends up becoming a monstrous human machine that cannot sustain itself in reality. It only reaches the dead end of suicide. So this is a kind of the bedrock of this desire to go into the screen. Actually, you cannot go with that, realistically speaking. And then this dilemma can be further illuminated in more realistic films that show the subject character's touch of the object body on screen. Ingmar Bergman's Persona, for example, shows a child touching a maternal face, suggesting that touch is the primordial desire to go back to the mother's body, to become united with it, to dissolve one's boundary made of the skin, and to abandon one's individuality as well. So when there's a kind of touching screen motif on screen, I would say I automatically, but then I often think that it is really related to our primordial desire to actually abandon our individuality, going into, being merged into the other's body in a way of losing oneself. There's always impulse like that. But then, again, there's a limitation. This is actually my book covers image. Wim Wenders' Paris, Texas. As you may know, there's a picture where the man sees the woman realistically, like a real window, but the woman who cannot see him, who is actually her ex-husband. So there's an asymmetrical mutuality working here too. And also, when she touches her mirror screen, as if to want to go beyond it, his face overlaps with her face. So again, kind of the interface image that condenses the shot and repulsion here. That shows the desire of reunion in a very ghostly way. And then now, I'll briefly show. I don't have enough time. This is the ending of a very short film by Roberto Rossellini. It's called Virginity. It was included in omnibus film called Robocop. So here, this guy is obsessed with this woman who was supposed to be very virginal, but then she, pretends to be very sluttish, to just repel him. Then he goes back home, and then he projects her image, and he wants to touch his body, but at the same time, as you see, he cannot go into her body, right? Because it's still to walk, and then her image itself is projected onto his body as a kind of a screen, and then this shows a kind of the double body. The body is a screen, and the screen is the body, and then this is a kind of comic tragedy, which is somewhat already forgotten and neglected film, but I found it very, very interesting. Here, the ending shows the main character, as I said, and then he moves to the screen as the body to touch. But here, interestingly, his body also becomes a screen on which the object of his desire is projected, and he touches it, but at the same time he touches just himself. Right? So this is the concept of body interface. In this case, interface is double body. Screen body and then body screen. The screen as body always provokes desire to touch. But at the same time, there's always kind of the body becoming a screen on which the object of touch itself is projected here. And then the suggestion is that there's an intrinsic dialectics between the subject and the object in this case, which I would call ambivalent tactility, which means that I want to touch it, but when I actually touch it, I don't actually touch the very body. I only touch the surface of the material device and interface. Right? So tactility is already there's ambivalent. We want to touch something, but at the same time, by touching it, we know that touching itself is impossible. It says that we want to go beyond these touches. And this is very related to the concept of the body as a phenomenological interface. And then I go into psychoanalysis, phenomenology, ontology, and so on and so forth, that are all talking about the body as, and then also the concept of the embodiment. And I want to see this ambivalent tactility in many cases in a way of suggesting that this may be another important characteristic of interface, because the fact that we want to touch means that we are already separated from the body. We have our boundary, our skin itself is a boundary that constitutes our identity and our individuality. But at the same time, we also have the desire to go beyond this individuality by touching it, even going into that kind of body that we desire, and so on and so forth. But then that is not possible. So this kind of ambivalent aspect of interfaces and experiencing interfaces is found in many films. And at the same time, there's kind of slight alternative to this limitation in touching the screen body itself. And that is actually the second phase of the body becoming a screen. Here, this is Ojima Nagisa's film, the man who wrote his well-known film. The film which itself is projected onto the director's girlfriend's body in some sense. It's like fictive and fictional way of negotiating between this desire to go into it and its limitation. And then this kind of inscription of a certain image onto the surface of the body can be found in PWA's pillow book in this way too. But at the same time, the actual inscription of certain letters or images are also found in many cases. Like Mizoguchi Genji's Ugetsu Monogatari. Here, the talisman itself is quite onto the body. It's not projected, it is just written material. And then Christopher Nolan's Memento. The body becomes a kind of mnemonic interface to sustain his own identity through the pursuit of his fictive goal to revenge his mother's life, which is already done. He did this revenge, but then he wants to forget about it in order to sustain himself, because otherwise he would have no reason for survival, no motivation to go on with his traumatized mind. So interface is ambivalent on another level here. It does construct subjectivity while simultaneously undoing this subjectivity, putting it in a perpetual unfinished state. But then he has to go on with this ambivalence itself. Otherwise, there's no way that he can live. So that's an important aspect of it. Okay. So this is actually the end of the second phase. Very briefly, I still have 10 minutes. I want to finish before 7 p.m. So I will briefly just summarize what I want to talk about. For example, this is another photo image from your window. Now, in this case, I want to talk about the whole window as a kind of a quasi-screen. And this is the very concept of quasi-interface. Why? Because it's not just a window. It's like a triptych mirror, but actually, each part is almost like a curtain. So the curtain rises just like in the theater. So you are already positioned in a movie theater. This room itself is the theater, the darkened room from which you can see the outside once the whole curtain is raised, and so on and so forth. And then also there's kind of this film strip effect. These series of windows appears almost like a film strip at certain point, as in this case. And then also this telescope itself is not camera, but it works almost like a camera, and so on and so forth. HITCHCOCK'S syndrome essentially has this beautiful image of eclipse. Suddenly the sun itself changes into a kind of quasi-camera in the sky. But then this is important. Why? Because this kind of effect only occurs when this type of three-dimensional illusion of reality loses its three-dimensionality, shifting to its two-dimensional. So this shift from 3D to 2D, in some sense, enables the immanent interface of a surface of an object surfacing onto its surface. And then this is, in some sense, found in many other cases too. At the end of this film, again, this intake vent becomes a kind of quasi eye or camera or even screen like that, while losing its three-dimensionality and so on. So this is about the surface of the object, and the illusion itself is redefined. In this case, of illusion of interfaciality, losing 3D into 2D. There are a lot of quasi eyes like that, and then also there are also quasi film strips. This is a letter from unknown 1-1, but then this picture, the landscape itself is almost like a film reel that is actually patterned by this guy, and then you have this kind of film strip effect, and finally the lady from Shanghai shows mirror maze where all effects are created through this type of quasi film strip, and then there's a lot of interesting shadow condensation. But then this kind of virtual immanency itself is broken, right? Because people want to get out of it in order to retain, recover their subjectivity. But at the same time, the line from this quasi camera to film strip to film quasi screen itself shows a kind of a process going into the immanent virtuality itself. And then here, there's a kind of screen effect, Chongqing Express, as you may know. The ending of the Taipei story shows the whole surface of the building itself becoming kind of a liquid screen here. And then this is an early film by Abel Gance, where the whole screen itself becomes real like a malleable surface, like a water effect. So there's a kind of process of dissolving solidity into liquidity and finally into gaseosity. This is Hindu-based, where all people dancing around look almost like what I call the kind of immanent things in a very Sonian way. There's still motion there, we can recognize it, but then the suggestion is that certainly the surface of the whole world itself turns into its immanent virtuality, which in some sense interface is related to the concept of disabilities. This is another experimental film by Lazaro Molinari. And then the shadow and the light effect becomes this type of immanent space within our action. Finally, there's the case of the subject. Again, Grace Kelly in Rear Window shows a beautiful face. When you have such a face, we immediately want to read the emotion of this character and so on. But then this is actually one way of looking at the face. So in this case, I kind of define the face itself as a kind of quasi-interface that has multiple directions in terms of what it signifies. Okay? Because this is another aspect of interface and individual. So on one hand, it refers to the inside of the character, her emotion, her identity, her social status, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, you can simply enjoy or the pleasure of looking her face and then skin and color and whatever, which has nothing to do with, for example, the character's interiority itself. So there are different ways of looking at the face, and there are different ideas and theories about the face, especially in prose up to. And so this is the face of the subject. The face itself has a multiple directionality in signification, and then a lot of theories are involved in looking at the face in this way. For example, this famous face of Joan of Arc, in some sense epitomizes human emotion, and then the Bible Savis, Anna Karenina Bible Savis looks at the very image in Godard's film, And then these are very, very typical of human emotion, and the face as the window to interiority. But at the same time, John Epstein or some other film scholars who were engaged in, for example, the notion of photogeny, were obsessed with the surface effect of the face that is shown there, which is not about the character's position in narrative or something like that. It's just simply about the cinematic effect that kind of causes a certain fetishistic desire to enjoy the very surface effects. Okay? So the scholars like Roland Barthes talks about the third meaning, that is not denotation, that is not connotation, that is simply about the viewer's own desire to watch something there as individually important for him, which is nothing about, has nothing to do with the other people's view. So this is very individualistic and then fetishistic enjoyment of faces also. And finally, and then another point is actually the face itself is a certain machinic simulacra of itself. So the subjectivity that is contained in face is never stable. Sometimes you can have this kind of mask. This is an African tribe that in Harris of film shows demasking facial itself. It's Korean film Thai, which is about plastic surgery. Korea is a paradise of plastic surgery.
Yes, no.
And then George Méliès' early film on that shows this magic of face itself is detached from the body, and then Total Recall shows the face itself has nothing to, having nothing to do with the identity and so on and so forth. And the Warhol's face looks like a ghost face. This is blowjob, and he is in some sense experiences the blowjob, which is an offspring's face. But when he looks at us, the audience, we don't look at his eyes. It's almost like there's still asymmetrical relationship with this one, and then we cannot reach this otherness in some sense. And this is actually the final phase of the faciality that I want to focus on in terms of ethics. Sometimes animals' faces, like the grizzly bear in Harrison's pillar, and then Life of Pi, tiger looks like sometimes a very precarious life that says you shall not kill in the regulation way, which means that actually we want to take care, when we even take care of it, sometimes it disappears in a way that it is unreachable. And that this is the absolute otherness that is embedded in certain films that I want to focus on in terms of ethics. So this is like that. Finally, I have images of subjectivity, but then I will just stop here. And then briefly, in terms of conclusion, I can go to conclusion. So this is a kind of my way of remapping film ideas and film theories. So there are still conveyor belt of interfaces, and then the kind of the merit of this type of remapping is that you can see many different, sometimes incompatible theories in relation to the relationship between metal and camera and so on and so forth. And then, for example, semiotics and psychoanalysis and Marxist feminism are basically about spectatorship that is related to the interaction between screen and eye and so on. So it's kind of a remapping different ideas, while at the same time finding new discoveries in terms of a new potential connection. And also, you can see kind of limitation. For example, religious ontology has nothing to do with the spectatorship. So, and then finally, the digital. So, when it comes to digital, what happens to the interface? For example, digital doesn't have a filler. Then how can we reposition and then rethink of this interfaciality? That would be my kind of future project. Then in my book, I kind of stopped at the moment when I wanted to get back to film theory this way. And then the suggestion is that actually, like this, film theory itself can be remapped in this way. But then I really wanted to suggest a kind of general theory. What is interface? It's not simply about the cinema and media, but even our culture and civilization could be interfacial. Why? Because we needed something in order to experience the outer world, right? Which means that, again, there is always a gap between our understanding of the world and the world itself. And between them, there is an interface. So in this case, the interface always enables us to experience the world, but at the same time disables us from really going into the real as such. So this kind of ambivalence, which I emphasize on and on, is always there. But at the same time, we still need this kind of interface by updating it through digital media and so on. So I want to see kind of what would be the new challenges in interface in the broader perspective. Thank you very much.
That's a lot to digest, I think, from about 45 minutes to an hour. And it's he developed a very imaginative theory of cinema, and one of the things I like about it is the way he range over such a wide range of films, and also synthetic theory. I want to get back to sort of some very sort of probe you on sort of some very basic questions. The book's called what's it called? Cinema After Film Theory After New Media, but new media actually plays very little role in your book and in your presentation. And I suppose the question that raises for me is what exactly is the relationship of your project to new media? I understand that you take the concept of interface, the word interface, from new media context. But I wondered whether you could speak to what it is about the nature of the interface in new media, or the way in which new media was conceptualized the interface. How it is that might have bearing on your concept of the interface. Because, I was put it another way, your concept of the interface, you're a translator of Derrida, and I think you say that in the summary of the book, but your concept of the interface seems, the way you presented it, seems to me like a master concept, rather like difference, that actually it's purporting to explain, provide a sort of a material version or object-oriented version of a concept that actually, in which sort of it's the sort of the self-derealization or dematerialization of the object in its interaction with other objects, be they sentient objects or non-sentient objects. So in that sense, it becomes a theory of everything. And well, we have cinema here, and we can see then exemplifications of this, chosen examples, of which you do so, choose very astutely to demonstrate, say, how a screen can function in that way, or how the face can function in that way, or how an object can function in that way. So can we get? I just wanted to sort of, probe you a little bit more on the specificity of this term with respect to new media.
Okay. Yes, actually, this the final chapter that I was talking about, and of course, some images about new media is supposed to. Let's just show two images, for example. New media concept here. Okay. This one. It's like a TV journal, which was made by a group of Australian scholars here. Here, this viewer becomes an editor of all different fragments from film history. So he created his own, film using these fragments, which are available in this way. And this is only possible because digital media can create such a kind of available and flexible ways of interfacing images like that. So what happens to new media? I still have to look at it, but at the same time, I think that there are a few kind of hints here. For example, I want to define the digital itself based on our digit, which is finger. And this is the index finger. And index finger means that we always use this finger in order to indicate something. and this guy uses his own index finger, just like the agent in Minority Report. He wants to index, this is the crime, but then this indication always kind of, provokes his own engagement. The subjective engagement into that event or the situation itself is more how can I say it, facilitated through the digital, because digital media reduces the gap between the actual event and then the subject's place and so on and so forth. So I think this is not simply, it's not a kind of radical break, but it's like really the augmentation of our subjective contact with the interface, as I showed in the screen touching images and so on and so forth, right? And that is maximized in digital culture, I think. So in this case, our uses of the digital, the digit of the index finger using digital interfaces going into that situation and so on and so forth occurs in many cases. Not only in this kind of cinematic installation art, but also in reality too. There were a lot of important demonstrations, like this is documentary film Burma Bourget. It's when there was demonstration, democratic demonstration in Burma, a band of street journalists who used this kind of digital camera shot this thing, which was banned in the country. But then they, circulated through the internet and so on and so forth. Finally, it was made into this kind of film that exactly shows how our use of the digit as the finger in front of this kind of digital device can enable us. It enables us to get into this context much more immediately, easily, actively, and so on. So becoming kind of producer and active agent in a certain situation seems to be probably one of the most pertinent interface cases in the digital culture.
Right. One might want, but if that's one's starting point, one might want to think of, one might immediately think that if one's building an account of the interface on the basis of digital media, one thinks of the certain kinds of properties of that digital media have, which are properties like the capacity for interactivity, which you're pointing to there, that the concept of the interface seems to be salient and pertinent and mark the difference in our experience of screens because of the capacity of us to actually engage in a material way and reconfigure what's on the screen and have the screen, as it were, talk back to us in some way. That there's a process of engagement between the spectator or the user and the object, the apparatus that they are engaging with, that brings about a change or transformation. And one might think that's a very important aspect of the concept, or very important, even one of the central definitions of understandings of our concept of the interface. But it seems to me that in spite of all your examples, which I think are very resonant examples, the cinema is not like that. That is, there's no possibility of, as you point out, I mean, as the Rude case actually demonstrates, there's no possibility of interactivity with the cinema screen. Indeed, there's a difference in the nature, fundamental difference in the nature of the screen, isn't there? Because a film's projected on a screen, it's not of the screen, as it were, whereas a computer interface or interface is actually of the screen. It's not simply it's not detachable in any way. So I wonder whether cinema is actually, if you're looking at the interface from the standpoint of new media, I wonder whether cinema is actually an example of an interface. If one's paradigm is that of if one's paradigm of the interface, and it's and your argument is filth, or at least your subtitle is filthy after new media. If your paradigm of the interface is indeed that of new media, which may be seen to be conceptually tied to the prospect and possibility of interactivity is so one could read back and see. I can accept that one and I think you do. From this perspective, you can see your work in a very interesting way, as looking back at cinema and seeing the way that cinema has been used by directors to imagine interactivity, proleptically, to imagine the possibility of the new media interface, and to dramatize that in various ways, and to take that seems to me. So it's after new media in that sense. It's sort of reading back in, back into cinema, the anticipation of new media. But I question whether, in fact, cinema is in fact an example of the interface. If it were, then why would we need new media in the first place? It's like cinema. That's what new media. That's the revolution of new media. That it creates an interface out of the screen.
I see. Oh, I think that there are mixed ideas here, basically, in your understanding and in my understanding as well. For example, so there is no interactivity in cinema itself, which I wanted to focus on because there's always the limitation in terms of content. At the same time, I wanted to see the actual characters in cinema. On cinema, within the aesthetic space and the narrative space, right? It's not about the audience themselves touching the screen. It doesn't happen. It's still don't know. But then, as some films that I showed, and others as well, kind of opposed the questions about this idea of touching screen and interactivity and so on and so forth. But at the same time, suggested that it may be a failure. But then, this experience of failure itself is kind of how can I say, something performative in some sense. By doing so, they those characters experience something new that could not have been possible without this kind of experience itself. And I think that's important. There's always something changing there. Like, at the end of the video as well, he kills himself, but that is not the conclusion of suicide to some extent, that, you cannot go into the video drum and so on and so forth. By jumping into the video drum, he changes something, in his own body, which is in some sense feminized and also masculinized at the same time. That is more important than in some sense the interactivity itself or the goal. I think that's important. So I wanted to focus on that kind of thing, and that's why I wanted to define interfaciality in terms of ambivalent theory and so on. And then that was my question to your first, I think, point. And then your second point. Then, if that is kind of the possibility of interface in cinema, why do we have a new media?
Yes, if cinema indeed were an interface, why would we need new media?
Well, new media bring some new changes to interface as well.
Well, yeah, but right.
So it's like the concept of this book itself is like a loop, right? I started from new media and go back to film theory. Then I find the interface already there, and your question, if it is already there, why do we have new media? Well, how can I answer this question? I don't know. That's something that I have to in some sense go through, probably, if for my future project. Now I slightly put aside that this is subject, as you know, but then I will definitely go back to that.
My point. Well, one way you might say is that cinema. One way you might argue, but I don't think this is the way you argue it, is that cinema provides a metaphor for new media. It provides a way of imagining a condition of existence or a way of interacting with the world that we don't yet have. And so that you again, it's this, but it's not actually an I mean, I suppose. I want to, in a sense, I want to know where actual interfaces, what role actual interfaces are playing in your theory, because I think that in a way, it's almost symptomatic of your reasoning, of your argument, that the actual interface doesn't play a role in the book. what plays the role in the book are virtual interfaces, imagined interfaces, and so on, which are what I would think of as metaphoric interfaces. Like, to see the face as an interface seems to be a very imaginative but metaphoric way of conceiving of the relationship between the self and their appearance, the appearance of the self. It's fascinating, and you can see how you use brilliant examples, like the Korean film Time that you mentioned, where clearly there is this imagination that of the face as this detachable entity from the self.
I see your point. Yeah.
But it seems to me a metaphoric conception of interface.
That's actually the trajectory of the book itself is like that. It starts with actually an actual interface, like in the camera, in the screen on
Well,
screen.
you're saying that interface.
Yes. But then, yeah, then it moves.
See, I don't think the camera and the screen are the same kind of thing. Because there's the same kind of object. Because, as I say, the screen seems to me not, as I say, not part of the film. So the screen is merely a surface on which the film is projected.
But it appears and works as an actual, artificial interface for the characters of the movie, the narrative space. And that's why I wanted to focus on Rear Window Person, and they can share too, right? They have the actual video interfaces, and then they see what's going on there. Sometimes they don't know as well. And that was more interesting for me. So it's like yes, you are right. I understand your point. It starts with that kind of game, but then move to kind of quasi interface, which are much more better. And finally, I wanted to redefine the images themselves as interface. Right? Why do I need it? I think that, well, first of all, interface itself is not like just a new media specified term, right? As I said, it's very multimedia, and then it doesn't have to be really like just a monitor or something like that. People really no, you can say, for example, in sociology, they say that okay, this kind of vunui is a social interface between some speakers and the audience. It's just very metaphorical in some sense, but at the same time, it's widely used in that way. Then why should I not use in some sense in that way, in terms of cinematic use? So the title itself is just already like a cinematic use, it's metaphorical.
Is an interface for you something that is always perceptual? Clearly it's not always something tactile, but is it always an interface for you a perceptual entry into fiction? Well, basically what I'm thinking here, is literature for you, is writing for you an interface?
That's what I want to do in terms of my suggestion of interfaces generally. So I really want to, in some sense, see if that is convincing for other scholars as well. This idea of interfaces general term, which in some sense, as you point out, I in some sense think this is more pertinent than Derrida's idea of difference. Difference means everything, right? But then it's a little like based on the linguistics, and then the linguistic differences, which doesn't have an image set. But then interface includes the image, and it starts with image, which is, I think, more fundamental than language. Right? So I think that's why I wanted to use it more widely and expand the notion to everything, actually. If it works in that way, in a pertinent way, and then convincing way, I want to test it in some sense, right? That's why I developed this illusion. So I should be tested.
Okay, let's open it out for questions. Thomas?
Yeah, I have a rough questions. One way that I would answer your question, Richard, would be to say that, of course, the term interface does belong to new media, but the very fact that it belongs to new media is very important because it then allows us to designate, differentiate, name all kinds of things which previously we didn't know were interfaces because we didn't have the word. But the whole point is then that being in new media allows us to, as Seung-hoon was doing, reclassifying everything that preceded it, but the very condition of being able to reclassify it, that you cannot actually specify what new media is, because you're inside it. So in other words, the term, as it were, precludes you from actually naming the digital media as part of it. In that sense, you're right, that there's a kind of, the cinema and all the other types of interfaces are, in that sense, second-order interfaces, or what you call metaphors. In other words, they are on a different ontological level, but interface is a term that marks where you stand as you re-describe and re-theorize all that which preceded it. So, the dilemma is actually inherent in the very concept.
But why can't we, you say we can't name what new media is? Well, we can't describe what new media is because we're inside it.
We can do it, but that misses out what to me seems to be the crucial gain of what Seung-hoon is doing, and that is that he's actually giving us what I would call a very tragic notion of the cinema and all the other media relations to reality, because as you keep pointing out, an interface is something which both gives you access to and prevents you from having access to it. So it's that double nature of it. If you simply, as we always do, or as for instance I do in my film theory book, you name the screen, you name the cinema screen, cinema window, cinema portal, cinema mirror. In other words, all the examples that you've given, I could very easily slot into my sequential scheme from outside to inside. The advantage of what you're doing is you're giving us one term, which in one sense condenses all those others, but at the same time it actually creates a relation between those, rather than they simply being successor of each other or alternative to each other. They're actually inherently related to each other in what you call asymmetric mutuality, which I now call a tragic relationship. And so when you ended up with saying that the interface may be a general theory, it occurred to me that interface, actually in a completely different vocabulary, is human consciousness. Because human consciousness is exactly that which both wants us to be part of the world and which stops us from being in the world. Animals and other creatures that don't have consciousness in the way that we humans have, don't have that problem of interface. So the interface is the very condition of being human.
Well, not according to Seung-hoon. Not according to Seung-hoon, it's not. Because his theory implies that objects have interfaces.
At the base of the impulse.
Well, the very constitution of matter, in the sense of, in the Bergsonian sense of perception, implies it entails an interface.
Yeah.
But that's always in relation to a human.
No. This is pure perception. This is not pure perception.
Well, my sense is that philosophically speaking, you're right there where Descartes and Kant were constantly going back and forth between the world and our perception.
Well,
because what is pure perception if it's not connected to? Is there something like pure perception without human?
Well, that's Bergson's concept. I think it's ludicrous, but that's Bergson's concept, and that's the one that Seung-hoon.
One amongst many that he's actually itemizing.
Yeah. Well,
it's human, not itemizing.
Okay, point out one thing about pure perception. I didn't say pure perception itself is an interface. Our eye itself is derived from that pure perception, which is already immanent interface, embodied interface. So interface is still human. It's something human.
Oh, I see.
Yes, you know. Okay. Yes. In this sense, it is related to that concept.
Okay. Yes.
So thank you so much. It's I think very kind of, I would say not tragic, but also very heroic attempt to re-systematize film theory and lots of different examples. And I think I can maybe have some of the same reservations you should expressed about. I almost feel like the book is great, and if you take one interface out, it'll be as great, But let me make my question more specific. I mean, it's true that in a very general sense, we can think about interface as a way one world and present it to another world. But I want to go back for a second to kind of historical original meaning. So when we think history, think about, for example, radar. Radar screen, that's the classical interface, or your car dashboard, or your graphical interface in the computer. And I think the basic property of all these technological interfaces is that there is some data which is not easily readable and understandable in human form. So think about what's on a hard drive, which has lots of numbers which are corresponding to data files and corresponding to outputs of software, and it's like becoming sensitive, so it can be presented in some kind of sensorial way. Right? So in the case of radar, we have a dot, there's this, there's a kind of scan. In the case of computer, we have these things like desktop metaphor, so we used to have at least files and trash can, etc. So what I want to do is kind of ask you, point out and ask you what you think about what I think is fundamental difference between this original idea of interface and what happens in cinema. Right? So the original interface is a kind of visualization. So basically you have numbers which you can't really make sense of, and they have to be visualized in some kind of way that you can understand them sensorially. So you start with something which is kind of not really visual. But in cinema, you start with something which is actually very visual, which you might already understand, right? I'm looking at you, I see two people, there are chairs. But the cinema restages it, and maybe it does something to it. But this to me would be one of many examples of how interface, in its original sense, is I think fundamentally different than what you actually find in lens-based art, let's say, such as cinema, because you're actually starting not with some numbers, you're starting with something which is already in a visual reality, something which already we understand.
Yeah, I think that was a very important point, especially at the end of my book. Actually, I use the example of internet map. You may know the mapping of internet, portals and which is in some sense it's a sublime image of what cannot be visualized, right? The entire world itself is like that, and how can we map it in some sense? At most we can have just any abstract, lines and their,
You need map of internet.
The map of it.
Like visualization of how internet.
Yes, correct.
That's a perfect example.
Exactly.
So many people say that any kind of visualization is interface, right? Because it starts with some numbers, some connections.
Yes, and so I touched on that point, and in terms of the body too. For example, Mark Hansen's philosophy of new media is exactly about how body functions as like an interface that actually translates the invisible, digital code and information itself into something visual. And I think this is another very important facet of new media interface that I want to bring up. But I kind of put it aside, and then finally at the end of the book, I slightly, point out that now the interface world itself is so immeasurable. The world itself is full of interfaces, not just creating a more efficient communication, but rather it itself becomes kind of a very murky matrix itself. In order to delve into that, we may need another kind of a big data interface or data interface or something like that. And I think I know that this is going on there. I think this is very interesting and challenging concept and phenomenon, which I don't focus on here. But then I am open to doing very substantial research on that. But at the same time, when I started with this concept of personality interface, I kind of in some sense oversimplify the common notion of interface in media studies, which is still based on kind of a mutual understanding, communication, connectivity, networking, and so on and so forth. So I know that there are a lot of invisible sources of data that actually prevent us from getting into that. At the same time, I wanted to kind of simply suggest that this is a common notion of interface. But then let's look at the cinema, which shows something completely different on the basis of images. So that was kind of my strategy. But again, I definitely think that this is like a transitional book in some sense. I wanted to use this term in order to be useful going back to film theory and so on and so forth. So while at the same time, if this is not as comprehensive as I expected, or is not convincing as I expected, it may not work. But so I really want to see the challenge of the future.
The questions for Seung-hoon.
You have a question?
Yes.
I'm a PhD student in cultural anthropology, and I work with Aboriginal media makers in Australia. And in ethnographic film studies, there's a lot of discussion about interface between ideas that are fundamentally non-translatable. And I just wonder if you see any purchase. You talked a lot about film theory, which comes out of Western philosophy and a lot of European ideas. Do you see this having a particular flavor in relation to intercultural film?
Well, definitely my basic methodologies and theories were based on those philosophies and so on and so forth. But at the same time, I thought that I really want to be open to any films. So actually there are a lot of non-Western films and the non-mainstream films too, and early cinema too, pre-digital cinema and digital cinema as well. So in terms of its application, or rather testing this idea of interface, I thought that it should be very, very comprehensive. So that's the way I use that. Maybe in terms of interculturality, that's actually my next part, global cinema. But then in this case, I mean, the film theory, the hardcore film theory was, well, we cannot help it as kind of Western. So that was the starting point. But at the same time, I wanted to be in some sense universalizing my own way. So that is one thing.
Any other questions from the audience?
So do you have a definition of interface in the book?
I'm sorry?
Is there a definition of interface in the book? Or are you using it?
My definition of interface?
In the book, is there a definition of interface?
In my book?
Yeah, or you just use it like strategically in
Okay.
different ways?
Let me briefly quote,
Please.
my preface.
Yes.
Interface is at work everywhere. Everywhere it is machines with all the necessary couplings and connections. It is also quasi-machines immanent in bodies, as I said, erupting onto the spaces and surfaces of subjects and objects. It is, above all, every systematic frame indispensable for us to map out uncharted territories, to filter off fuzzy and murky noise, to extract useful information and a vibrant inspiration out of this chaos, thereby making the world more understandable, accessible, controllable, and enjoyable. Indeed, not only the computer, but culture and civilization in general are interfacial products. So, this is one definition.
No, it's not a definition.
Okay.
It's beautiful, but
Yes. So, the second
just to be clear with definition.
So, but sometimes it strikes back.
Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. I wanted to read this passage. Thrown into our vision out of the blue, an interface can challenge our sense-making capacity for efficient and effective subjectivity, confront us with its beyond that is far larger and deeper than we can organize into our reality. We are attached and intrigued to what it only adumbrates and insinuates. While projecting images, interface prohibits our approach to their objects. We might desire or protects us from their danger. We might desire to ignore. That obscure object of desire, with such a fatal attraction, is conversely a trip switch to trigger our gradual transmigration to the desert of the real, the plane of immanence, the infinity of otherness, and to that extent, our radical transgression of subjectivity. An interface can thus appear as an informative image, beautiful and helpful, yet turning into a transformative screen that both reveals and blasts its unseen ground, unseen ground, whose sublime horizon leads us to the edge of our vision and subjectivity. What we see on the interface let us sense what we cannot see. Now, definitely, our life desperately depends on more and more interfaces, without which no sense of being embodied and embedded in the world could be formed and kept. But their relation to our subjectivity is as centrifugal as a centripetal, while fundamentally asymmetrical, ambivalent, immanent, and multi-directional. Here, maybe the interfacial fate of subjectivity, its aspiration and agony, paranoia and schizophrenia, only indicating that subjectivity is primarily conditioned by interfaciality. Love your fate. That was my.
It's really to put it simply.
Yes.
It's really the screen that lies between the real and the symbolic. I mean, it's really the pivot in the Lacanian terms between the real and the symbolic, or the game, the look, and the petit objet. I mean, isn't it?
Yes, that's why I used the Lacan, you know, at the beginning of my talk too.
No, but no, it's not, that's not right. You shouldn't give in to that. Then you've lost your case. You know how he feels about Lacan. I think what we've concentrated on is almost all the terms you use has either vision or space as their correlative. In other words, very strongly acts on the cinema. But what Lev is suggesting is that interface, in another sense, is primarily concerned with acts of translation. And then vision is really not terribly relevant to the problematic. So that would be the challenge. You know, from all your, I mean, when you read it out, it really is everything for everybody. But, and this is where I come back to my point, you're always phrasing it in what I would call a tragic way. You know, it's
But that's the Lacan, isn't it?
one-sided. Well,
I mean,
there
he's
was
the
tragedy before Lacan, you know. There was contradiction before
Yeah,
Lacan.
but he's the great tragedian, isn't he?
Can I have one more question very briefly?
I think that to
Oh,
keep your
sorry.
hand up, I'll now come back to you.
Linking on to that, I wonder if you consider the role of game theory in this, that transcendence between the real and the symbolic. Even just recently I was looking at an iPad that physically responds to the way you pleasure it. You look at it and stroke it until it projects a certain message to you that it's happy. And I don't know, that I feel like completely transcends the message of wanting to cross over, but it does cross over entirely. You respond to the way the iPad is asking us to respond. So I wonder if you consider it all going in that gaming direction, because there is no barrier, or at least less so. But not at all barrier you describe.
But I'm not into gaming theory and then gaming itself, but at the same time, as I said, that it's part of the new media interfaces that I want to go into, not now.
Because that is literally a realization of the video currency.
Yes, definitely. So I wanted to see a lot of the, you know, as you say, symptoms of new media in the cinema too. So there might be some relevance, but also I guess that there are a lot of challenges as well, as you mentioned. And then you still have a question or something.
Lev has a question.
So, you know, so I want to just bring in something which I think, I don't know if it's part of the book, but it was not discussed so far. Richard mentioned about literature, so that would be my question. So we didn't talk about narrative, we didn't talk about what I think is maybe one of the important things for 20th century film, is editing, right? So I would say that, you know, if you give us license to use the term like more loosely as a translation, but translation can be between different, let's say, senses, between data in the sense, or it can be the same real. So you can say, okay, well, maybe, you know, maybe plot is a kind of interface to a story, right? Or interface is like this kind of data, okay, this is everything which happened. And when you arrange it, right, in a particular way, you select what you're going to do, you go to the flashbacks. I kind of buy that, right? And I think if you go this direction, you could say with editing, to me, would be actually very, in fact, would be a very interesting example of how we can talk about interface in cinema, and also the camera, right? Because you can say with cinema, it's a particular way to present information, to structure information over time, you know, and you do it by framing shots, and you do it by editing shots, right? So I think that, so I don't know if you talk about editing, but I think it's actually, we can actually use this concept in relation to sort of literature or, you know, narration as well.
Well, I only talked about editing in terms of suture, as I mentioned.
Right.
So it's kind of the basic principle of editing itself is a suture process. But on the other hand, I think that would be an interesting idea. But at the same time, its relation to literature, for example, as kind of succession of signifiers and so on. This is something that, you know, so I am a little ambivalent in this case. For example, I wanted to focus on the image and not language actually. I didn't talk about sound either. It's just about image itself. So it has a lot of limitation. But within this limitation, I want to be very coherent and cohesive in terms of the use of interface, and then also expandable to other things and so on. But then, you know, still like, you know, it's very challenging. Well, how can we use this term in some sense in literature and so on and so forth. But even beyond, you know, going beyond this cinematic realm, I really want to, in terms of see how it works within cinema as relevantly as I expected. So I cannot answer your question right now. probably it would be interesting.
I did have a question about suture actually,
Yeah.
about which another's been written. The example of the, I mean, suture. The suture theory pertains to a specific way which describes it well, different ways. I mean, as you know, there's different accounts of how it works. But as you pointed out, basically, the idea of the visual field of one image, the point of perception of one image being represented in the next image. But of course, not all cinema works that way, and one can obviously, as we know, coherently tell a story in film without using that particular kind of strategy of connecting images. And so, in the cases, in the case like the horse's eye reflecting the, I know it's out of context, but I suppose my question is, I don't always see why, it would have to depend on context, why necessarily an image that represents within it somebody gazing should necessarily be something radically jarring or sort of undermining our involved emotional engagement with the film, or having such any particularly problematic effects. I mean, it's actually I would even go so far as to say it's quite a common trope of cinema to for a director at some point to do this, and we don't find it jarring, would be the hypothesis, because that's often the way we watch. We understand, narration in a more flexible way. We have a number of ways in which we can find narrative worlds plausible. One strategy is to represent it through what suture is, suture system. But that's not the only way. As we know, we can represent our talk, in a two-shot, or one could represent it in a two-shot from different angles to vary our perception of it, without worrying about without worrying about suture. So at one point in that, we represent the audience in the shot as well, and we show the implied audience, and that's where's the worry there? Where's the sort of the moment of a tragedy, where suddenly there's this sort of a radical undermining of expectation. That would be my sceptical response. And it's a rather to put all your eggs in that basket. It's like to take soup. It presupposes that there's only one way of narrating a scene.
I see. Yeah, definitely. But there was a lot of critique of the classical suture theory.
Well, right.
Yes, right. So, and then I also wanted to critique of suture in my own way.
Right.
But anyway, so I just wanted to kind of suppose that suture is not simply about the shot and reverse shot, but just the editing. Editing, whether continuity or not. And basically, it wants to be continuous, but then sometimes it's not. Anyway, editing means that anyway, one shot has to follow another shot. And then, in that case, I wouldn't really want to go into kind of the psychoanalytic aspect of that. As you say, okay, the subjectivity of the viewership is always destabilized by, being curious about the next touch until it comes into it. And I wouldn't go into the either.
Right. But even in a cognitive sense.
Yes, cognitively. I think it's much more about the epistemological desire to know what is next, right? And in that sense, the editing is still working in that way. And then another point, kind of the spectral moment of a shot and shot, reverse shot, condensation or something like that. It's a common trope, as we say. I just borrowed this idea from Jusek, as you may know. And then he gives some examples. And I think it was useful in terms of the idea that there is a kind of still a visual symptom that opens, in some sense, the outside. More, how can I say, not really radically, but how can I say, more effectively than just the continuity and things. So you can see a kind of how can I say, the reflection of the image, the shot into the reverse shot is not really like realistic. In many cases, it's like anamorphic. That's why Jesus wants to talk about the kind of anamorphic effect of the condensation of the shot and reverse shot, which creates its own kind of spectrality.
But it is really, but surely in the case of a mirror, for example.
Yes.
I mean, that's a pretty, I can agree that in some cases there is a radical anamorphosis going on. But say a mirror shot, I mean, the capacity to see what's behind you through a mirror. There's yes, I mean it's just an everyday thing, and films evoke those kinds of constructions, right? Those kinds of situations.
So I think that it's not about like there's A and completely different B. There's a kind of graduation in terms of social effect too. So you have the same sudden evolution condensation can be very continuous in some sense, very common trope. But at the same time, there may be some cases that cause a more spectral effect or severe effect, which certainly slightly shifts from the diegetic reality. So I think that was a little more important than simply talking about viewers.
And I agree. I found your cachet example very good.
Yes, exactly. It's not about really like a real shot, right? We just want to know more and more, which is never seen.
Okay. Any other questions? Let's thank Seung-hoon and have some questions.